We're here tonight to discuss the renewed challenges and new questions posed by Laudate Deum, the important follow-up document to the Laudato Si, just issued by Pope Francis on October 4th, the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. Before we begin the conversation with our panelists, I want to introduce Riley Talbot, a student here at Georgetown, a former student of mine, who will speak from her experience as a young person facing the realities of a changing climate and working towards solutions. Riley is studying government, theology, and environmental studies here at Georgetown, and is also a policy and outreach associate with the Catholic Climate Covenant. Riley, welcome, and thank you for sharing your remarks.
Good evening. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you to the initiative for having me here today to open this important dialogue on Pope Francis's newly released apostolic exhortation, Laudate Deum. This conversation about how the climate crisis intersects with our lives as people of faith, and specifically as Catholics, is urgent and necessary, and I'm so glad we're having it here at Georgetown. God calls humans to care for our common home, to be tenants of creation, to cultivate and care for it, which God calls very good. Pope Francis first describes this call in his landmark encyclical, Laudato Si, released in 2015, calling us to address the urgent challenge and, quote, to seek a sustainable and integral development, for we know that things can change, end quote. Last week, on the Feast of St. Francis, Pope Francis doubled down on his call for action to all people of goodwill, saying that in the 8 years since Laudato Si, quote, our responses have not been adequate, while the world in which we live is collapsing and may be nearing the breaking point, end quote. Throughout the exhortation, Pope Francis uses pointed language to highlight the shortcomings of the response to the climate crisis. He calls out those who refuse to accept the truth of anthropomorphic climate change and the technocratic paradigm that has created a culture of consumption, disregard, and materialism. In our spiritual formation here at Georgetown, we're taught the Ignatian value of seeing God in all things. That is becoming harder and harder as we begin to see species on the paths to extinction and air quality reaching harmful levels so that the beauty of nature no longer fully reflects the beauty of God. This ecological warfare, as Pope Francis calls it, is causing an unnatural divide between humans and the rest of creation. Pope Francis's writings about the depths of the crisis struck a lot of anxiety in me when I first read Laudate Deum. Yet he continues on with a call for solutions just as pointed as his description of the problem. He acknowledges that the climate crisis is not one that we can solve only with individual actions, but will require a multifaceted response with strong government action at the forefront. His clear, concise request sends a strong message. There is a path out of this crisis, but only if we act now. His message is not one of foolish optimism, but of courageous dedication. As the policy and outreach associate at the Catholic Climate Covenant, this call to action is one I take seriously. There are many ways where the United States has fallen behind in environmental policies, and Pope Francis explicitly names the United States as the highest emitting country in Laudate Deum. My work at the Covenant enables me to advocate across political parties for new and innovative solutions to the climate crisis at the systemic level. Pope Francis doesn't just appeal to the political sphere either. His call extends to all of us as individuals. How are we going to respond? I believe we can proceed with hope and fight this crisis. What if we begin by radically changing the culture here at Georgetown and in our home communities? What if we change it to a community where we hang dry our clothes rather than using the energy inefficient dryers? Where we take only what we will eat at Leo's and compost what we don't? Where we write to our representatives in Congress asking for strong environmental action? Where we each make a couple of individual changes that catch on to make a big impact? I challenge you to think about it. What is one way you are going to leave here today having answered Pope Francis's call to praise God? Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. Thank you for sharing such important context as we get started here today. We have 4 more outstanding participants in this discussion, and I want to take a moment to introduce them to you here at the beginning. First is Christiana Zenner, who is an associate professor of theology, science, and ethics in the Department of Theology at Fordham University. Her research and teaching have focused on issues of freshwater ethics, environmental justice, and Catholic social teaching. Sharon Levine is the 2021 Goldman Prize for North America recipient and the 2022 Latari Medal recipient from the University of Notre Dame. She leads Rise St. James, a faith-based grassroots organization that fights for environmental justice in St. James Parish, Louisiana. And we really want to welcome you, Sharon. Thank you so much for being here from Louisiana. John Mundell is the director of the Laudato Si Action Platform, which is a project of the Vatican Dicastery for Integral Human Development. He also runs his own environmental consulting firm, which is part of the Focolare movement's Economy of Communion, a business network that focuses on addressing economic inequality. And finally, Jose Aguto is the executive director of the Catholic Climate Covenant. He has previously worked at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the National Congress of American Indians, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's American Indian Environmental Office. And he served in the 10th Mountain Division of the U.S. Army. When we get to the Q&A period here, we'll be taking questions from those of us here in the room. And for those of you joining us online, please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Laudate Deum GU and by tagging GUCST Public Life on Twitter. And so I'd like to start now with getting an opening comment from everybody here that's with us. First, let's start with you, Christiana. What is the challenge at the heart of Pope Francis' new document, Laudate Deum? How does it reinforce and extend the message of Laudato Si?
It's always a little bit daunting to try to aphorize a pope.
Sure enough.
But here we go. I think the challenge at the heart is to situate ourselves properly as human beings, to release disordered attachments to techno-economic idealism that is misplaced, and get our collective acts together to remedy anthropogenic climate change on structural levels.
Fair enough. That's great. Excellent summary, I think, of where we are. Sharon, I'm going to come to you now and ask you, what is the challenge at the heart of Pope Francis' new document, Laudate Deum, and how do you think it extends the message of Laudato Si?
Well, in my opinion, I feel like the Pope is bringing a message down to us to try to save that planet and also to try to save human lives, try to save the environment. And he's trying to bring that message down to other people in Catholic faith. And I think it's a good message. And I think that we should abide by what he's speaking about.
Absolutely. I think that's the case, right? Trying to bring it right to us, making sure we see the challenge of it. How about you, John? Let's go to you. What do you see as the central challenge here of the new document, Laudate Deum?
For me, Pope Francis is challenging us to live out a more authentic faith life. He says in the document that it's doing that gives us strength in the human heart. So what does that do? That gives us, it sustains the passion we have. It sustains, gives us courage. But it also, he says, transforms our lives and also transfigures our goals. Wow, that's a pretty intense thing. So it's really an examination of conscience for me, first of all. Am I really living this in my day-to-day? And also, if I am I experiencing that kind of transformation in my life? Am I experiencing a new outlook that I have? And so for me, this is all about shedding more light on my relationship with people and planet and giving myself that examination of conscience. Am I doing all that I should, or am I just talking the talk?
Thank you. It really does have that feeling of calling us all to that kind of examination of conscience. Jose, how about yourself? What do you think is the central challenge here posed by Laudate Deum?
Sure. Well, I'm going to borrow a phrase that my colleague Elena Gaona said about in her reaction to Pope Francis's exhortation, in that Pope Francis's heart is broken. He feels very heartbroken by the fact that 8 years after Laudato Si, we're not seeing significant progress and in confronting the climate crisis. And in fact, we're seeing increasing greenhouse gas emissions that are threatening our existence. So he wants us to step into this with a lot of courage. And he gets very pointed. And the fact that he uses the phrase climate crisis means that he's very serious. And he's calling upon us to act with courage during this time.
Thank you. So we've heard about the challenge here, the examination of conscience that we're being called to, Pope Francis' broken heart. Christiana, let me turn to you for a longer conversation. You and I first met when Laudato Si was released. I remember that. And I remember how much I learned from you, that your expertise on the theology around ecological issues and what you bring to these conversations is just tremendous. I'd love to hear from you what you see as the central themes in this document and how it grows from and extends Catholic social teaching.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for the compliment also. It's a joy to be in conversation about these things. And I learned so much from the center and from the conversations that you all host here. How does Laudate Deum differ from and also reinforce aspects of Laudato Si? Well, like a good professor, I've got about 4 points. Both are rooted in a theology of dependence on God. So this is a theological document, even if it's also a very practical one. And there's an anthropology and ecology of interdependence. So dependence on God, interdependence with one another and other beings, other entities on Earth. Climate change in Laudato Si 2015 was one of about 6 signs of the times, or indications that our common home was falling into disrepair. In Laudate Deum 2023, as Jose so eloquently said, quoting his colleague, Pope Francis is clearly heartbroken about the ways that the message of Laudato Si, and especially the failures of remediation and attention to anthropogenic climate change, have just continued to escalate. So he points out, for example, that when Laudato Si was released, carbon dioxide was at 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. In June 2023, it's at 423 parts per million. So this then points to another similarity and difference at the same time, very Catholic both and, which is that there is a lot of science cited in this document. And so what was sort of assumed to be known or pointed to in Laudato Si is straight up in the footnotes here all the time. I mean, one footnote even says, this summary is drawn from 34,000 scientific studies. So he's not messing around. As such, he's also a little cranky that many Catholics, including people in the United States, and perhaps especially in the United States, have, in his words, derided or ridiculed the facts about anthropogenic climate change. And so very early on in this document, he takes a step-by-step dismantling of modes of climate denialism, both in terms of fact and rhetoric, and does so beautifully. I think that we could also simply say that where Laudato Si was longer, more of a kind of poetic series of reflections, more like reading a book than a pithy policy brief, Laudate Deum is exhortatory, it is pointed, as Riley said, and it has particular steps forward for action, which, as a teacher, I really love, because a lot of my students' responses to Laudato Si was, well, great, but what do we do? And so 8 years later, I feel like Pope Francis is saying, yeah, okay, I got that message too. Here's what you do. So there are other things that we can maybe talk about later, the technocratic paradigm, sure, anthropocentrism, but there's, yeah.
Well, I want to pick up on something you just said. I mean, this clearly, we've talked about this being an examination of conscience. We've talked about what we can do personally, but this document focuses on national and global action. And to get there, as you said, are a lot of policy recommendations, a lot of science. There are a lot of people out there who've reacted by saying, what is the Pope, what is the Holy Father doing talking about science and policy? Where does that fit in to our faith? Why do Pope Francis and the Church address these matters? How is this a work of faith and of Catholic social teaching?
What should a Pope do? Should he just pray? Should he pontificate privately? Should he lead liturgy? Real question. If the role of the Pope isn't to think about tenets of faith in light of contemporary reality, then I'm not exactly sure what the role of the Pope is. And so Pope Francis, in his very pastoral way, is, I think, here doing this. And he's also doing so in a way that draws on Catholic social teaching, tradition since 1891, give or take, that has been looking at the ways in which lives of faith and tenets of faith, and especially the deep and long Catholic moral tradition, would help to guide action and formation of individuals and societies in light of political, economic, social, and now environmental problems. So I do hear that critique. I hear it especially a lot in the United States. And I would just say, don't be cafeteria Catholics. It's not as if people arguing for particular pro-life legislation and celebrating certain Supreme Court announcements are taking a back seat when it comes to politics. So be consistent. That's what I would say to that.
Participation in public life is something we're called to.
And you know, even just theologically and philosophically, we're social, political animals, you know? So
absolutely.
Politics is part of life, and that doesn't mean ideologies, and it doesn't necessarily mean, it shouldn't mean sectarianism, but it does mean thoughtful reflection about the values and characteristics with which we want to participate in the process of living together.
Well, I think this is a perfect way to transition to you, Sharon, because when I think of someone who has taken our Catholic faith and put it into action in her community, the first person who comes to mind is Sharon Levine. You've worked to organize your community to stop industrial projects that would have further poisoned the environment and the people who rely on it in St. James Parish, Louisiana, where you're from. It's a place known as Cancer Alley, because of the toxic pollutants found there as a result of factories. You've been recognized throughout the country for this work, Sharon. How do you think Pope Francis combines care for creation and care for the poor, or in the words of Laudato Si', the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor? How have you seen that?
Well, in the work that I'm doing, I see some of his points, especially when he made the statement that the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which cause global warming. We have more hurricanes, more storms, and earthquakes, all of that is due to climate change. And he also says was stable until the 19th century, below 300 parts per million in volume. But in the middle of that century, in conjunction with industrial development, emissions began to increase. And that's true because of climate change, because of global warming. And in St. James Parish, we have an increase in petrochemical facilities, refineries, and they're all in poor Black communities. Whenever our parish officials vote to bring these industries in, they come into the 5th district or the 4th district of St. James Parish. In St. James Parish, we have 7 districts. The 4th and the 5th are the most impacted. The 5th, we have 12 industries within a 10-mile radius. We have another industry that's trying to come in, Formosa Plastics. If Formosa Plastic is built, it will bring 14 plants inside the big complex. The pollution will triple in the 5th district where I live. It will double throughout the parish of St. James. We will not be able to live. We will not be able to breathe the air. This is genocide. He's trying to protect the earth, the environment. And if we hadn't developed this organization, which is a faith-based organization, this plant would have been already started.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sorry, excuse me, go ahead.
We are fighting for our lives over here in St. James. We have funerals. Every week we have a funeral, sometimes 2 and 3 or more people being buried, mostly because of cancer. So many of my friends have cancer right now as I speak. So many women don't want to go to the doctor to check to see if they have it. Someone needs to do something, and I feel if Pope Francis bring it down to us, to the bishop, the priest, we can stand together in solidarity. We can stop this. We had our parish, sorry, I know I'm going overboard.
No, you're great. And let's just keep talking about that. I mean, to me, you are an example of how you take these teachings and put them into practice in a particular community. I'd love to hear more from you about what can other people here watching take from your experience about bringing your faith to a grave problem in your area. Maybe tell us a little bit more about how you got started and what lessons people can draw from your work.
I was told that you don't fight industry. When I went to meetings, this other industry came into St. James. They sold our high school. That was heartbreaking to me and to a lot of people. That's the school I graduated from. That's the school I was teaching at that time. A plant from China. They called a community meeting. We went to the meeting. We were devastated to find out that our school was sold. These people, now they changed it to Koch brothers. We had a parish council meeting 2 weeks ago. They want to expand. All 7 parish council members voted for them to expand. They are causing our death. They are murderers. Last night, we had a meeting with the parish council to give them a tax exempt. They all voted to give them a tax exempt. So we have to carry the brunt of paying property tax. When the industry that's poisoning us, our enemies, they get a tax break. We need money for our schools. We need money for the sheriff department. We need money for the parish council. They're giving it all to industry. Why? Because they are in the pockets of industry. We as a people are hurting. We are hurting mentally, physically. We can't breathe the air because it makes us sick. I couldn't go to the meeting last night. I was too heartbroken and I was too angry. If I would go to that meeting last night, I know I would have said something that I didn't want to say. I was going to tell them they are murderers. Our lives are in their hands. We elected them into office and they betrayed us. So I couldn't go to the meeting, but my daughter went and she called to tell me about it. I can't take anymore. I'm tired. Something needs to be done. Pope Francis could bring this down to us. We can talk about it. We can bring it to the pastors, the bishop. We can do something to stop this madness, to save our lives. All we want to do is live and breathe clean air, drink clean water. I don't think that's too much to ask. I don't know, I'm tired.
Oh, we hear you here, and we are doing our best to stand with you, Sharon. And thank you so much for your important witness. I think it's just vital that this information, this story gets out, and we're so grateful for all your work. John, let's turn to you. We've seen an example in Sharon's witness here about what happens at the local level. You work with the Dicastery for Integral Human Development. You work with the Laudato Si Action Platform. Why, and you lead it, you help lead it, why did Pope Francis choose to revisit Laudato Si now? And how can we learn from it? What do you hear from what you've heard today? What do you learn from that?
Well, I think listening to Sharon share her story about how this is all impacting her, the degradation of the environment, climate change. We've been hearing these stories around the world for the last 8 years. When we began the Laudato Si Action Platform 2 years ago, the intent was to bring together a community, an online community, and provide a mechanism for people to act, to develop action plans to improve the environment. As we did this, we also highlighted those stories like Sharon's around the world about the real impact. As you can tell, as I was listening to Sharon, you can tell you begin feeling this, right? It's a visceral feel that you know, if you're just talking about reading papers or things, you don't feel this. The platform, in the same way, has heard these stories, shared them at the highest levels in the Vatican, and this has inspired more than 8,000 participants to join the platform throughout the world. This is basically, these are participants that include dioceses, parishes, religious institutions, universities, schools, healthcare networks, all wanting to do something to plan for action. But that small amount, even our 8,000 participants, which represent with the diocese maybe about 77 million people on the planet, they've signed on to the platform, but not everyone started action. And I think the Pope realizes not only the impact of climate change specifically in this document, but also the lack of real action and positive energy that needs to go into solving this crisis, and he's not seeing it. And so I heard the same thing when you're talking about emotion. I heard the same thing in Laudate Deum that as we were reading this emotion from the Pope. So I think the reason why he did it is he hadn't seen the action he's needed even within the church, and it's getting worse.
Well, let's extend that a little bit, John. Obviously we talk about grassroots action here, and it's a real call to action for all of us. But this document in particular lifts up international action, right? This talks about the need for international cooperation to combat climate change. How does it call attention to and challenge COP28? Maybe you could tell everybody a little bit about what COP28 is and what we should expect and how this is a challenge to that.
Well, COP28 is our annual meeting of the people who are trying to make commitments worldwide, the countries and the entities that are trying to set goals and trying to see progress. What we've had is a number of years the COP meetings have occurred, and the Pope recognizes they've been, even though there's been some positive news from gathering people, they've been basically very ineffective. And why? Because they haven't been held accountable for achieving goals or even monitoring whether they're achieving those goals. So I think the Pope wanted to point this out as this is a key meeting in December that will happen in Dubai. Maybe, we don't know, because of all of the conflict going on. But he really wants to bring attention as this is a key moment, a critical moment that we need to see commitment to have a change, to restore confidence that people are going to make commitments that mean something. So I think he held it up. You could read Laudate Deum as kind of a document that's more about global politics and multilateralism and all this. In essence, the Pope, though, is saying, remember, those countries that are coming to this meeting are all influenced by local activities. And so there's an encouragement also for people to get engaged with their political figures, with the groundswell from the bottom up, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more, to influence the targets that are being set so that we can have real action. So I think that's why.
Okay, thanks very much. Jose, let's turn to you and talk about how this happens here in the United States. You lead the Catholic Climate Covenant, which is an organization that forms a key part of the U.S. bishops' efforts to respond to the teaching in Laudato Si, and works to put them into action here in the United States. And at the end of Laudate Deum in particular, Pope Francis challenges wealthy nations to act with urgency. He has a particular focus on the United States. Can you talk about how should the church here in the United States respond? How should U.S. Catholics respond? What was your reaction to that?
Sure, thank you. Well, first to say that, and to acknowledge that we have a lot of division in our church, and there is a difference of opinion within our church on how to act on climate change or whether even to act on climate change. But the church is clear that care for creation is an integral aspect of our faith. And so we at the Catholic Climate Covenant and many of our partners seek to weave that as an integral aspect of our faith. And so responding directly to Pope Francis and his call that we in the United States have quite a large carbon footprint, we, the Catholic Climate Covenant, are just releasing an initiative welcoming Catholics to respond directly to Pope Francis and have options of committing to reducing your food waste, committing to reducing your meat consumption, to talking to your pastor and asking him to step into this, because this should not be a partisan issue. This is an issue of faith and our common future. And also, because he had layers of individual and institutional and systemic action, for us also to consider with regard to COP28, we at the Covenant are asking that the Biden administration consider the debt forgiveness of developing nations to free up those funds in order for them to be able to adapt to the climate impacts, because they are impacted first and worst by these impacts. So we offer that option. I know that sounds like a little bit of a PR for us, but we do want to respond directly and say that we are acting and demonstrating that the Catholic Church is stepping into this. Going to the aspect of what we can do as people of faith in the Catholic Church, I mean, we are meant to be bridge builders. We're the largest faith tradition in the world. And when I go to church, I see people of all different nations and all different socioeconomic levels, and it's just a beautiful tent that we can bring to this divisiveness and really believe that faith transcends partisanship. So let us step into that role as peacemakers, as bridge builders, because this is the fundamental start. Because we're seeing this division in our nation, we're seeing this division, and it happens at COP28, happens at every COP, where you see nations which are heavily dependent on petrochemicals and oil and gas stymieing any significant progress, global progress. And also to note that many of these petrostates, because they are owned by their nations, are immune to the calls for divestment because they are not owned by private investors, and that they own 90% of the fossil fuel reserves that are in the ground right now. We need to bring them to the table from a fundamentally moral place. And for Pope Francis and our church to elevate that moral call moving forward.
Thank you. And one more question for you, Jose. I was struck by how clear it is that Pope Francis is focusing on the fact that we're at a real turning point for the global climate crisis, and he uses this language of crisis. If you had to say, what are our priorities right now? What would be our priorities as Americans? What steps are needed first and foremost from this document? In your view, what would you say?
Well, first I'd say he puts it in different levels, the individual and then the systemic. And Christiana, you mentioned this about stepping into the political participation. So on the individual level, we can continue to do these individual actions, which are incredibly important. And as Bill McKibben said, they're additive. But when we step into the societal, then they're multiplying. And so we need to really focus on bringing people to the table of enacting and asking our legislators and those who are captains of industry, frankly, who are unduly influencing our political process, and ask a fundamental moral question, which he said in Laudato Si, and he said he repeated in Laudate Deum, which is, what would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so? We all need to be putting this question in front of the billionaires, our legislators, the leaders of nations that have a lot of petrochemical resources. We need to be moral in this call. And I was really struck by that phrase that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin as we're coming down those steep stairs. The age of nations is past. It remains for us now, if we do not wish to perish, to set the ancient prejudices aside and build the earth. We really need, as humanity, to be stepping away from our national self-interest, from our individual self-interest, and really stepping into the common good and what is the foundation of our faith as Catholics. Let's live into that.
Let's move forward and have a little bit of a conversation among us here, and Sharon, you too. And first, Christiana, I wonder if you have any reaction to what you've heard. And then I'd love to ask you sort of what is distinctively Catholic about this, right? What is distinctive in Catholic teachings on ecology that we just can't, that's different from what we get from environmental groups, NGOs?
Well, that's a great pairing of questions because that's actually what I was going to go to.
There we go. So
this document is fascinating in so many ways, and it bears rereading, people. It's a good one because it just keeps revealing new things each time you read it. And so the second time I read it, I paid a lot more attention to the claims about multilateralism from below. So as John, you indicated, there are questions about how well the Conference of Parties proceedings have worked, and Pope Francis gives a history of some good ones, Kyoto, some failed ones, Glasgow, and the question of COP28, how's that going to go? And he says so much is riding on this. But he also says it's not just about that. It's about the mechanisms and the mode and the integrity by which collectivities of people, whether nations or industries or nonprofit organizations, civil society, participate. And so he talks about activism, and he talks about multilateralism from below, and he talks about how solutions and especially diagnoses of problems, and Sharon, your work here is so crucial, so powerful, and so your moral language, which I totally want to come back to, is so resonant and so vital that the kinds of topics that Sharon has brought up in her rightly awarded work and advocacy are those that need to be leading the conversations at these levels of elite policymaking. And Pope Francis essentially says, it's going to be the local activisms, the smaller countries, that are so often derided as ancillary or superficial to the real work of the political and economic powers. And he's saying, you know what? No. The political and economic powers, so-called, so historically understood of the world, are those who are blighted by what Augustine and many other theologians, see, theology.
There you go.
What they would call disordered desires. And so part of what is theological about this document is the Pope's ability to draw implicitly and explicitly on Christian tradition and say, this is an example of disordered desire. This is an example of things going wrong, of an infatuation with the idea that profit is the only thing that matters, or that technology and economics together will surely solve all the problems that we ourselves have also created. What hubris, he says. Let's rethink those precepts.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Sharon, I wonder if I might come to you, since we were just talking about, Christiana was just talking about your work. I'm struck by the fact that you are the daughter of civil rights activists and are now engaged in activism yourself of a different but related kind. Listening to more about what goes on in St. James Parish and about your work, there's over 150 petrochemical plants along an 80-mile stretch of the river. St. James Parish is a predominantly African-American community. Cancer rates are 50 times higher than the national average. How does race play into all of this and the disparity we see?
Well, just like I said before, our public officials, our leaders that we elected to serve us and to protect us, they protect the white neighborhoods, not the black neighborhoods. Whenever an industry wants to be built in a white neighborhood or white district, they vote against it. Whenever they want to be built in the 5th or the 4th district, they all vote for it to be built there. I don't know if they think that we don't know any better, or they don't think we want to live, but they seems to win. And just like the people that lives in the 5th district, the councilman that's supposed to be protecting us, he lives here too. And we told him, if we die, he's going to die too, from all the pollution and the water being contaminated. And he don't seem to care. I think he cares, but I think he's in the pocket of industry. He's a minister. And I think that he's sorry he went on the side of industry against his own people. And I don't know, I feel sorry for him. I pray for him because he can't get out of it. He's too deep in it. And our governor also. Our governor is the reason why we have so many petrochemical plants, especially want to put them in my district. And we have another one that's trying to come in. And he wants to speak with us because he knows that he has to go through Rise St. James to get in here. And we don't want him to come. So he's asking for a meeting with us. And we said no. And people are already dying. And Koch brothers don't care because they are going to be emitting 3,000% more pollution in the air, greenhouse gases. And they also want to put pipelines in our wetlands. It's going to kill our seafood. So we can't pack up and leave. We don't have the funds to pack up and leave. And if we did, I don't want to leave. This is my home. And this is where I want to stay. So we are being sacrificed for them to make that profit.
Well, and I'm really struck, we were just talking about what's particularly Catholic about this, and I think central to Catholic social teaching is responding to injustice of the kind that you're describing right here. So thank you very much for that. John, I want to turn to you and ask you how Pope Francis challenges the environmental movement, the religious community, national leaders, right? So what is he saying to these larger organizations?
I think he's calling us to be to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. You know, we have a greater moral voice when we're doing what we're saying. This is one of the reasons the Pope has encouraged this Laudato Si' action platform. If we are able to coalesce all of these positive actions and hold them up in a transparent way, we can share with the world how the Catholic Church is actually doing. And right now we're not doing so well. But there's hope because we see stories all around the globe of initiatives, tree plantings, recycling programs, solar panels. There are a lot of great stories and actions that are happening. When we, as Jose was saying, when we look at going to COP, we have to go now with a different kind of voice because I don't know if you're aware of it, but our status has changed over the last year. We have gone from just being an observer at these global meetings to being a participant. Well, that's a little different. That means the Vatican City and the Catholic Church are more like a country than just someone who can go throw stones at other people saying you're not doing enough. So what should we do? We should continue, and I think the Pope is challenging us, continue to act in each of our various spheres, whether it's in our families or individuals, whether it's in religious congregations, or whether it's in our parishes or dioceses, to have real action, to share that action, and then to bring those actions together with more of a moral voice now for people to listen to us. In the past, if we haven't been doing that, it's been like an empty echo. We don't have anything behind our words. So I think that's what he's challenging us to do. He's challenging us to get real, to put together a journey that leads to ecological conversion and in the direction of more integral ecology.
Thank you. And let's go to you, Jose, for a second. I mentioned earlier that Pope Francis really calls out the United States pretty strongly in this document. Right before it was released, Pew came out with a study that said, you know, American Catholics pretty much have the same level of beliefs about environmental issues as Americans overall, and except for it really noted a difference in political partisanship, right, and how that drove it. How do you think you all are working? How are U.S. bishops working to change that, to change U.S. attitudes and the attitudes of U.S. Catholics around environmental issues? What concretely is being done by Catholics here in the United States, and in particular, the work that you all do?
We are first grounded in our faith, our common shared faith, and bringing that group of virtues into the conversation, recognizing that we hold the life and dignity of every single human person as sacred. And, you know, going to, for example, what is happening with Sharon and all of her neighbors, their lives are sacred. And to make that connection that if you are polluting their environment and causing multiple cancers across the community, that is a life issue. And that's so that we as Catholics, as the institution, need to be stepping into that kind of advocacy because it is an integral part of our faith. And so combining and calling, as we say in Catholicism, you know, respecting the dignity from conception to natural death, well, let's step into every single phase of what that means. And that means stopping pollution in St. James Parish. So having these conversations with our fellow Catholics is a gentle one. It's one that we want to do so based on the Catholic tenets of loving everyone. And I think that's part of the distinctive dimensions of what it means to be Catholic, is for us to see the sacredness of the person across from us as well, with whom we have differences, and really work through and build bridges towards that commonality.
And I'm about to come to questions from the audience. So Christian will be in the back with a microphone, and please, we'll start to go in just a second. But Christiana, do you have a response to that?
I do.
Reaction?
Thank you, Kim.
one of the things that I think is marvelous when we come together to talk about a document like that is to see how many different lenses that are very real and have such integrity we all see and inhabit and act forward from. And one of the things that I'm hearing so much in the love and care and protection of human dignity and the sacredness of all life, the attempt to say no to environmental racism and sacrifice zones, the efforts to work at the levels that we can, one of the questions that we keep coming back to is, well, what should we do in the face of this? And sometimes that requires saying no. And Sharon, I hear you so much when you say you are so tired of saying no, and yet it just keeps happening. So one of the things that as a professor I think about is, well, what are the spheres of my influence? And one of them is, of course, in a university. What's a Jesuit university for? At best, I would like to think and hope and act towards that being a proof of concept of a better world, of advocates for folks who are not being heard in the democratic ways that they are speaking up, Rice St. James, many others. And one of the things that I've heard twice from Sharon in your incredibly powerful theological and moral language is that these are not just neutral decisions. These issue forth, even if indirectly, in genocide, in murder. And climate change is not abstract in these ways. It sounds abstract, but it's always mediated through something, through pollution, through water. And those are what our bodies take in. And those are the toxic sites that have guilt behind them in these cases. So the other thing that I heard Sharon say twice, and I just want to lift up here, is the Koch brothers. Now, they alone are not the only political and economic elites who have disordered desires and a really culpable way of making money. But they have a lot of power. And one thing that Jesuit universities have, and many others too, is the choice of when, whether, and why not to take that money. So I think this is something that universities such as the one I'm at, Villanova, Catholic U, Creighton, maybe Georgetown, many others, need to be reckoning with and giving a proof of concept of how to say no.
And a place where young people can really take the lead in driving that.
Absolutely.
Too. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring the microphone over to you. Christian, right in the back.
Hi, thank you.
And please identify yourself if you may and stand up and let us know.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Angela Christian. I'm a cradle Catholic. My question is, as a person born in the closing days of Vatican II, I'm wondering if this moment and these two documents together are not sort of a step towards Vatican III and a real living out what the documents that conference produced. Thanks.
I might have first come to you, John, on that, and then maybe Christiana, if you have a reaction. In other words, right now, as many of you might know, we're over in Rome, a Synod on Synodality is ongoing, which in many ways is a way of bringing Vatican II into this particular moment. And I'm struck that these documents, that Laudate Deum comes out right at the beginning of that process as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it was a busy week last week, right? We had the Synod starting, the document came out, the end of the season of creation. I'm not sure I completely understand everything, what you think about a Vatican III, but I think what you're saying is, at least what I'm hearing you're saying is, we're in a new phase here where this idea of this bubbling up from below, coming up and influencing not only policies, but also actions of the church is becoming a reality. And it's messy right now, right? I mean, we saw that in the whole process that we went through with receiving the feedback. And so I think in this environmental realm, this climate change realm, the same thing is happening. And the feedback, we're hearing it all the time on the platform, 8,000 participants feeding back up. And we're trying to offer to the church and say, listen, this is what the people are experiencing. This is what people believe on the ground we need to do. What do you think? And so it's a new time, I think. And maybe if you call it Vatican III or a new phase, so be it.
let's say, bringing Vatican II forward, listening to the voices of the people. Any reaction, either one of you?
You're the one who's just been there, Kim. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me just say that I do feel that a striking difference is to see how bishops are listening and sitting with and engaging with lay people in this process. It's remarkable, and that cannot but be good, right? And I think that what a good question to say that this is what Pope Francis is calling for here with Laudate Deum as well. Other questions? Go ahead. And thank you very much, all of you, for being here.
Hi, thank you. Bill Hederman at CSIS here in town. I know the tradition here is to start with the question in the form of a question, but I have to make a remark first. I led Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz's faith-based action council on climate change. And I always thought from my working with them that the Smothers Brothers used to say all the world's religious leaders got together and they had one agreement, which was they had the one true faith. But I think that we now can add there is concern about climate change to that consensus. My question was following up on the point about Jesuit universities. When I heard, for example, Jose, you talked to challenging billionaires and corporations, et cetera, I did not hear challenging the actions of the church with its substantial holdings. It's not going to make a global difference, but if it was global, it could make a difference. And is anybody starting to try to nudge and confront on that?
Great question. Jose, you want to speak to that? Church holds a lot of property, a lot of buildings. Any way in which the church is being challenged and can be challenged here to act?
That's a deep question. I'll start with an anecdote. I used to work with the National Congress of American Indians, which are the tribal leaders, and do some energy legislation on the Hill. And I, of course, was promoting renewable energy legislation for the tribes. But walking next to me was a tribal leader who was seeking increased ability to tap the coal underneath his reservation. And one of the challenges is that he's got 50% unemployment and massive social challenges, as we're all relatively familiar with. This high suicide rates, the drug use, the domestic violence, all of the markers of environmental or social destruction. Do any of us have the real authority or ability to judge this man when he's trying to find any sort of way to find funding for his people when there are no other economic opportunities? I'm not saying that we have a solid answer there, but these are many of the challenges, like, for example, of having economic opportunities in environmentally compromised industries upon which you and your family are dependent and need to feed your children. We need to be able to accompany these kinds of communities into an alternative way. We can't simply say what you're doing is wrong. And I think also many of the bishops have these same kind of conundrums where, they're holding lands or they actually have oil wells and they're deriving revenue from oil and gas. I get that as well. So, they're challenged. So this is not a black and white issue, but I would say that we need to accompany those who are in these industries and figure out ways to extract them from that. And that's part of us also being compassionate in our approach and also nuanced in our approach, because singular moral judgments are not going to work. And in fact, they're going to turn folks like that away, and we're going to be oppositional, and it's not actually going to work. So,
well, and I feel like that's something. Oh, do you want to go ahead?
Just one other thing you were asking: is anything happening? Well, there are things happening on the platform. We have one of the Laudato Si goals we have is ecological economics, and it's all about how and where we invest our money. And there have been a number of webinars we've had in the last year about where religious congregations are putting their retirement funds, where dioceses are putting their retirement funds. These are real issues that you can develop plans for and share that experience with others. So there is action going on, and there have been a couple of resources in the last year specific to this. You'll find either on the Laudato Si movement or Catholic Climate Covenant or the platform pages to address some of these issues.
Thank you. One more question. Back in the back.
Hello. Peter Rajic, Environmental Justice Program here at Georgetown. Sorry for the hat. I'm from Slovenia, and air conditioning here is very strong, and it's polluting a lot of our environment too. As a Jesuit, I cannot resist the phrase that you, Christiana, used several times: disordered desires or attachment. It also sounds very close to Jesuit spirituality. In fact, the 30-day retreat that St. Ignatius proposes is about getting rid of disordered attachments. And you, John, you spoke about living our faith authentically. And I'm just thinking, we mentioned the individual, communitarian, systemic approaches to change and conversion. And some solutions could be so simple, and we've had them in Catholic and other churches, for example, abstinence from meat. And we know that we consume way too much meat, and its agro industry contributes 30% to climate, to greenhouse emissions. And imagine that the Pope did a little bit of a tweak, like popes do with prayer. They add a decade to the rosary. It's very little, but billions start praying differently. He added the St. Joseph part to St. Mary in the Missal, and all priests now pray that. And I just wondered, and I know this is very difficult because we have to listen to local communities, and synodality is about that too, adding a little bit about our food values and how we treat ourselves as we consume food. It's really about values, it's about morality, and it could be also about our faith, how we relate to ourselves as we stand before God, as we eat. And think about theology of eating and Eucharist, and so do we really need all that much meat? Now, I'm not suggesting the Pope should say it, but I just wonder, how can we from below create that kind of movement through conversion? So we have to start practicing ourselves first. That would make ourselves involved, but also our communities and hopefully systems. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I mean, central to the Catholic faith, we are embodied people. The table is so central to how we think about ourselves. What do you think about this, Christiana?
Well, thank you for your beautiful and thoughtful reflections that operated on many levels. I mean, you might not want to tell the Pope what to do, but because I'm a professor, I kind of want to. I say that in jest. So I'm in the middle of writing this book right now that started a little while ago called Beyond Laudato Si. And this thing happened on August 21st, where a little news item was dropped that the Pope was writing an update to Laudato Si. And so I thought, ooh, well, this is exciting. I have like these 7 chapters on things that the Pope might say more about, or that the church or people of goodwill, or all people on the planet, depending on what document you're reading, might take up and think about critically and constructively. Agriculture, food sources, consumption patterns, and especially meat consumption is one of them. And it was one of the things that I really hoped was going to be quite explicit in Laudate Deum, because there is an opening for it, as you point out, not only in terms of what is very factually true, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, as I put it to my students, cows fart a lot of methane, and that's a pretty potent greenhouse gas. But also the conditions of animal agriculture are problematic. And as people of the table, as you said, Kim, there are already practices in place in terms of abstaining from meat. This is an area of sacramental theology and ethics that could be and so deeply, intimately, and easily tied to social and ecological justice, that is absolutely an invitation that I would love to give to the Pope and extend outward. And one person who's written stupendously on this in academic context is David Clue in the UK, in case you want to follow up on that.
Wonderful. We'll wrap it up now. We've come to the end of our time. And so I want to ask for one more closing comment from everybody here, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we have coming up here at the initiative. What I'd like to ask each of you, and I think I'm going to start with Sharon. I'm going to start with you, if that's all right, asking you how Pope Francis challenges each one of us to think and act differently. So how does he challenge us? I love the phrase he uses in this document, in Laudate Deum. He says, we should participate in a pilgrimage of reconciliation with the world that is our home. Well, how do you begin on that pilgrimage, Sharon? What's one action that people can take?
Oh, I think that, first of all, we should start with the church, teaching what's going on. And first thing I would do is pray. We don't ever start our meetings without prayer. We pray a lot and we seek God for everything that we do. So we should have a World Day of prayer so we can come to some type of conclusion to stop all of this madness that's going on and stop all of this genocide and come together. All the nations should come together and get together and stop all of this.
Thank you very much. John, how about yourself? What's one action you think people can be challenged to do from this document?
I think it's starting, as Sharon said, with prayer, but a certain mindfulness. Living each day. You know, we get so many things that we face every day. We get caught up in the day-to-day that we lose really this big picture about why are we living? And so I think for me, it's this mindfulness of living each moment during the day, recognizing that with the person that's before me, whether I'm talking to you all or a private meeting. And why do I do that? So that I'm aware of my connection with the universe and with everything around myself. So I think taking that time and also getting in touch with nature. I mean, since COVID and beyond from here, I've done much more, been outside, taking walks, feeling grass, hugging trees. I mean, to me, you have to have this visceral connection that gives you the motivation, the spiritual motivation to then change your behavior. So that's what I recommend.
Thank you. How about you, Jose? What do you say? One way Pope Francis is challenging each one of us to think and act differently.
To step into what it means to be reconciled with our neighbors, with our enemies, to build those bridges, and to have the moral courage to ask us to work together for our common home.
Thank you. Reconciliation. So we've heard prayer, we've heard mindfulness, reconciliation with our neighbors. How about you, Christiana? One action that we can take. What's the challenge here?
Begin where you are. See what your gifts are. They may be well honed. You may have a JD. You may be a consultant. You may have a military history and work in advocacy, or you may be a student studying economics. Begin where you are and with who you might become, and see where the needs of the world can intersect with that. There is no solution in the abstract. There is no solution in the singular. These are plural realities, and everyone has something to bring. And you might not know what it is until retrospectively. But that's part of the delight and the journey. And find people who make you laugh along the way. There is joy and goodness and connection in the world, and we have to remember that, because that's part of what makes us human.
What a beautiful way to end this discussion. And before we close this out, I want to let you know about some upcoming dialogues and gatherings that we have coming. Next Wednesday, we have a Latino leader gathering on strengthening community and resisting individualism, challenges for young Latinos and contributions from Latino culture. It'll begin with a happy hour at 6 p.m., followed by a dialogue at 7 p.m. at Georgetown School of Continuing Studies. And we'll be talking with Bishop Evelio Menivar Ayala, who is the auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Washington, new here, wonderful, wonderful bishop. We're really looking forward to talking with him, as well as young adult leaders here in the community, to talk about how young Latinos can resist pressures towards individualism. We'll continue this conversation on isolation and community on November 2nd, when we will be hosting the Washington, D.C. premiere of the documentary Join or Die, which focuses on sociologist Robert Putnam, who you may know from Bowling Alone and Our Kids and others. focuses on his work and why joining a club might be the most radical thing you can do these days. We'll premiere Jordan or Die, the Washington, D.C. premiere of this, again on November 2nd. And it'll be followed by a reception, and then we'll have a dialogue with Robert Putnam and others afterwards. And then finally, on November 14th, we're holding a Dahlgren Dialogue, an historic Dahlgren Chapel here on Georgetown's campus, in partnership with our colleagues in the Office of Mission and Ministry on solidarity with Jesuits and the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. So for those of you here in the DC area, we'd love for you to join us in person for these dialogues. They'll also be live streamed for those of you who are unable to come to Washington. Please visit our website for more details and also for more follow-up resources about this discussion and these other discussions. And finally, I just want to thank my colleagues, as always, John Carr, Kimberly Mazik, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sunin for helping to bring this wonderful discussion together. I want to thank all of you for joining us here, right here at Georgetown and online. And finally, please join me in thanking Riley Talbot, Christiana Zenner, Sharon Levine, John Mundell, and Jose Aguto for being a part of this dialogue on caring for the environment and each other, Pope Francis follow-up to Laudato Si. Thank you very much.